like to say I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss.
That's great.
Like, it's probably going to work out.
Yeah.
I like to believe in our better angels. Many of these capabilities, for all their benefits, have an inverse, right?
Yeah.
There's an alpha and an omega.
Hello, and welcome to the Skapa Podcast, where we bring visionary leaders across government, academia, and industry to share their big, bold ideas of the future, but more importantly, how to bring those ideas to reality. And we have a very special guest today, my friend and best-selling author, August Cole, former Wall Street Journal
That's right.
tech reporter and futurist. And this is the Skapa Podcast, Creating the Future. So I couldn't imagine a better person to have on the podcast than you, August. Welcome.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here in Boston, to have you on my home turf.
Yeah. We're just outside the TD Garden. Is that what they call it here? The
Correct.
Boston Garden?
Home of the Bruins.
Home of the Bruins, home of the
And the
Celtics.
Celtics.
Yeah, the playoffs are about to start here really soon. So it's a really cool location, and it's great to have you on the podcast. You started as a reporter, is that correct?
Even before the Wall Street Journal, I worked in the early days of the online news business. I started actually as an editor, if you can believe it, at CBS Market Watch. At the time, it was a really unique outlet in the late 90s, middle of San Francisco during the first .com boom. You could sense that the internet was going to change everything. And so to have that front row perch, both as an editor who ran a lot of our breaking news coverage, but also our company itself was a product of that same, I would argue, experiment. We were doing something like democratizing financial information and news that, back in the day, you could only get with a Bloomberg terminal. So we had a wonderful cast and crew. And I was there for 8 years before I went to grad school for a year and then ended up at the Journal.
What did you take away from that experience? And it feels like past is present. It feels super relevant to the situation we're in right now in defense tech.
It's funny. I often think about that era on a couple different levels. Number one was, as you say, the landscape, just seeing people trying things, seeing capital washing through companies and how some people were making great strides with it and others were tripping over their own, checkbooks, seeing real innovation and experimentation, which I think is at the human dimension really exciting. And then as a writer, working in financial news wasn't what I wanted to do forever. But because we were building our own, back-end tools, code and data, our own publishing platforms, and having had a great series of mentors there, I found that, almost like 20 years later, I learned so much about how to write on deadline, how to manage really complex, in the moment situations. Though even when you're doing something like writing about the future, that, hour by hour, day by day work, month by month was really valuable in becoming a professional writer. And maybe it didn't feel like it at the time, but boy, in retrospect, I'm grateful for it.
That's so interesting. And I could see how that would be very valuable in narrative and working against deadlines. But before that, you went from there to Wall Street Journal, correct? And
yeah. So after Market Watch, I went to the Kennedy School
Okay.
for a year, and they had a mid-career master's program, here in Cambridge. Phenomenal, life-changing. I think for me particularly, and this is relevant now because there's, reconsideration of the value of these programs. I got to spend time with people from the, military that, wasn't something living in San Francisco or Chicago like I'd done that happened a lot. And so that was not only academically really meaningful, but also just, it's a networking group of friends I have to this day. And so from there, I pivoted to the Wall Street Journal and started working in DC.
I had a similar but adjacent experience. I went to the Fletcher School, also here in Boston, while I was at the U.S. mission to NATO. And in the classroom, you had diplomats, business people, and that sort of exposure.
That's the best.
It was illuminating. It was like fresh air for me. And it really, set up some of the stuff I would do later, at Task Force 59 and here at Saab. But yeah, that sort of mid-career education is like oxygen, isn't it? In terms of
it really was for me. And I think, being a believer in the value of the experiences you don't plan for as formative. And often that's because you're out in the world encountering people who you may not have, thought you needed to know or wanted to know. And that is arguably what makes the kind of work we're all doing, I think, really interesting. It's funny, the other, zigzag dimension to the history, of me getting to be in this room with you was, when I worked at MarketWatch, I was really chafing to get out of the newsroom and report, and Hurricane Katrina happened. And so I was able to get down to, the area around New Orleans. And I ended up, because Dow Jones had bought our company. And so I ended up bunking with a bunch of the journal reporters. And so when it came to, looking at what I was going to do after grad school, I actually reached out to some of those reporters that I'd spent, a week with, in really close quarters. And that relationship, again, driven dimension to like the journey is, I think, something that in the tech world is everything, right? And that's something that I think, when you're considering where does this all go in defense tech, even if the companies that you see being formed today, even if the technologies end up in dead ends or cul-de-sacs, the people who have had a chance to work together, chance to collaborate, maybe even compete against each other, those are going to be the partners of the future.
Yeah, I experienced this. These collisions happen so often. And I always say there's no accidents in life, right? There's no accident that we're here today talking about this. There's no accident that I read your book, Burn-In. And I have to tell you, it was formative in what I was creating at Task Force 59. When Sky and I designed the capability sprint model, which started with a tech scan, right, teamed with DIU, then it goes to a burn-in. Can you explain for our audience what a burn-in is?
So the term burn-in in the title of this book, it represents this, moment where you have to really figure out, does the technology work or not? And you can't simulate or even really predict often until you actually get it into the real world. And so that felt like a really prescient title for a difficult to name book, because when you're dealing with, a counterterrorism story, it's about an FBI agent and the robot partner, tackling basically a terrorist trying to turn America against itself. What do you call a book like that? And so getting to the core of the issue was really like America itself was in a burn-in moment. I mean, we're in it right now.
Yeah. And we were, and so I'll just continue the cycle, but then I'll come back to the burn-in and come back to this book. So we would start with the tech scan, teamed with DIU, get best in breed robotics, get them out to Bahrain, do the burn-in. During that process, trust is built and, winners emerge. Then you would scan those out to rapid iteration with end users and with partners, super relevant. And we'll talk about that in the future. And then you scale. And then there's this kind of virtuous cycle that we called the capability sprint model, which Sky Moore and I co-designed. Really, Sky was the architect there, and she was my last guest on the podcast. So if you haven't seen that podcast, go watch the Sky Moore podcast. I sort of skipped ahead to Burn-In. What's that story about, and why did you write it?
So Burn-In was important for Peter Singer, my co-writer and partner in Useful Fiction, and great friend, for a couple of different reasons. We'd written Ghost Fleet, which came out in 2015. It's crazy to think that was over a decade ago, which depicted war with China. It was in the vein of Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, a book that was very meaningful to both Pete and I when it came out in '86, and we wanted to tackle that, but in this new context. For Burn-In, though, we were experienced enough to have written a book and had a sense of what we were good at and what we needed to get better at. And so Burn-In allowed a couple things. One was to focus on a central character. This is kind of more the creative and writing path piece of it, but also to tackle the kind of the next question. An easy answer to Ghost Fleet's, I would argue success would be to write a sequel. We had a couple different, pretty decent storylines, but we were taking more of a Michael Crichton approach, which is find something that just you really want to get into and understand and communicate, and then go at it with a story. And so Burn-In was that, rather than extending the Ghost Fleet storyline. It technically takes place in the Ghost Fleet universe, but it's about a FBI agent, Laura Keegan, who's a Marine robot wrangler who's, working for the Bureau in a counterterrorism role in DC. And she's given a robot, a biped robot partner. It kind of looks like an Atlas, but I mean, that's the shorthand to describe it. It's much more childlike in its form. And at the same time this is happening, she's being forced to work with this thing. Society around her is being transformed by automation of high-end jobs, like her husband's, who's a white shoe lawyer. He's unemployed. She's watching her daughter grow up in this world where, her favorite things are not alive, machines, but they're, toys that are very different than the ones that I grew up with. And then similarly, just seeing the chaos and tension and anger that, different parties are manipulating and exploiting to really kind of tear the country down to build it back up. And she's, front and center of that fight to try to stop that from happening.
And you wrote that book at when?
We wrote that book, we started in probably 2017, 18, and it came out in 2020.
6 years ahead of where we are right now. The impact that book had on me, it really brought to life the trust required in the human-machine teaming aspect.
Yeah.
And trust, I believe, is ultimately gained by, doing what you say you're going to do. Well, in the case of machines, they don't always do that. And so what can happen is perhaps they do something better than you had imagined, a good scenario. But if they do something that you're not expecting or did not want to happen, the trust is broken. And that machine, and in our case, robotics above, on, and below the water, it will just be put aside, right? Were you writing a book about trust, or were you writing a book about society? What were you?
I love that you picked up on that word, because that was at the core of what we were trying to distill the book down to. It's really difficult to take a novel and say, what's that one word? But I think Burn In actually lends itself really well to that, because there's trust at the human machine relationship level. And, separately seeing how the book has been popular in certain communities, special operations, for example, some of the cyber folks, because of that human machine dynamic and that elemental piece of trust. But looking at how trust is breaking down in the America of Burn In, which we thought was the 2030s, it feels like the tomorrow, America, or the today sometimes. And I felt like working with Peter on this, there's a technical side to Burn In where you can read the book and understand how to use AI for infrastructure hacking, where are cyber vulnerabilities in the systems we need to most rely on day to day to have a functioning society. And at the same time, how much we've come to trust, and think that those are something we can take for granted. A bit like Ghost Fleet had that with, say, GPS and some of these other weapon systems. And yet also, when you start breaking trust, what happens? And that is, I think, a really important message, especially for people working in defense technology today, when there is so much capability that is distributed into the hands of not just a few people, but, a handful. And, edge computing is going to even, I think, make that more important to really kind of the could-should paradox that in engineering and design and really kind of considering the overall almost operational use, again, for defense tech, but even you could say the same about consumer tech too.
One of the most interesting things I learned sort of growing up with one of my very dear friends was a screenwriter, and the power of storytelling, the power of character development, the power of narrative. But where did you get this beautiful art of storytelling that so much encaptures the reader?
I think there's a longer tradition of using, narrative to help us understand the future. And my own experience with it really started probably, I was 10, 11, 12, starting to read a lot of the Cold War science fiction. A lot of it was very apocalyptic, but also a lot of, future military sci-fi too. You had writers like David Drake, you had David Brin, people who were really thinking very seriously about the world we were in, because science fiction was really helpful at thinking that through. And, journalism for me, on a good day is a form of public service and something you can really lean into, and storytelling to get people to care and think differently. And the things that I wanted to write about at the Journal particularly were the problems that we might have, particularly in the defense industry and technology, things that I covered. And so finding a better way than that purely fact-based approach, because I'd often be frustrated in wanting to write about something. My editors would say, that's not a story, or at least yet. And I'd say, I know, that's why I want to write about it.
Yeah.
And then it would happen and they'd say, why didn't you write about it? And we'd get in this awful do loop. And so when I quit that world, I took that risk, right? And there's a couple points, I think, on the way for me, writing Ghost Fleet as a fictional book with Peter, where we could have probably more credibly written a nonfiction book initially, but it would have missed out, as you said, on this opportunity to use narrative. And so narrative is, part of what we're wired for as humans, for sure. It helps us understand the world we're in better by talking often about the future. And particularly when you really need to get into difficult issues, when you can actually have a character through whose eyes you can see them. And in our particular flavor of this sort of narrative uses a lot of facts. We do a lot of nonfiction research, which both of us love. There's a lot of conversations like this or simply reading nonfiction material so that you can produce something that a broad audience can actually consume and they can remember. There's myriad GAO reports I read as a reporter. I'll never, cross my memories again, right? I'll never kind of draw them out of the basement, but I can talk still about some of the sci-fi novels that William Gibson wrote, like Neuromancer, and how it depicted AI, 30 plus 40 years almost after I first read them. So to me, that's sort of the lessons I think assembling along the way. I'm a very visual person too. I used to want to be a photographer, honestly, in college and immediately after, but I realized after talking to a lot of professional photographers who said, hey, you should be a writer first. And if you can take pictures, you can shoot, great. But to me, that's often how I kind of think about these things in that visual manner and then build that world.
It's so funny you say this, because as I was launching Task Force 59, with this experience with my good friend growing up, I understood the value of storytelling and narrative. And I was trying to tell a story about what we were doing, a little bit of reveal, conceal, so there was some messaging to other folks across the Persian Gulf as well. But what I was trying to do was tell a story about these amazing humans.
Behind the technology.
Yeah, behind
100%.
the technology. So the Sky Moore, the Sophia Haft, the Tom McAndrew, these amazing, the Ray Miller, who's actually, on mission in Epic Fury right now, these amazing humans who are taking huge, not only personal risk, but professional risk to try this new little startup, Task Force 59, out in the Middle East. I was also trying to communicate speed, but not just speed, but velocity, in a direction towards an end state. I just wanted you to know, and you and Peter to know, that you inspired that work, which was in many ways starting to bring to life what you wrote about in a book. You've had a couple examples of where the, Ghost Fleet, there's a Ghost Fleet in the Navy. So how does that feel that you're actually shaping the future of war from your writing?
I think if you'd asked a 16-year-old August, like, hey, this is going to be your job, a few decades later, I would, probably say no way. That's not a thing. But to what you're kind of describing and figuring out the different methodologies and a lot of experimentation to do that becomes as important as the ultimate end product. It's not something that, in 2015 or 16 was readily obvious that was going to be useful. We believed it, but you have to convince people.
Right.
Sometimes that's one by one. Sometimes that's reaching, hundreds of thousands of people with a story like Ghost Fleet. And so, I think there's something to, the journey, and I've, watched your path too through Task Force 59, and it's almost like you're identifying characters, in the story, not just of the specifics of what you were doing for the Navy, but also in this transformational movement, right? Because it is something that you were at the forefront of, not unlike what people were doing in the 90s in San Francisco. And we're in a more pronounced defense tech boom now where it's more evident and obvious. But I think that's also really important too, that people can see themselves as the hero of their own story.
Yeah.
And a good narrative does that.
Yeah.
Velocity and speed is critical. And being able to, as you said, not just aimlessly spool up and move off in the wrong direction or in any direction that feels right, but rather having a vision of what you're moving towards, to me, is really important. And that's one of the ways that a lot of our narratives that we work with, in our work, a useful fiction is a split between training, like teaching people how to write narratives about the future so they can do that. But also we've written over 110 or so stories in the last 5 years for, clients that range from allies, in the UK to the special operations community here in the US. We've done a lot with them and some allies, Navy, the Air Force, the Army, et cetera. And projects have ranged from short stories to novel length narratives. And so that, to me, that's a sign that we are at a place where people value this. They're willing to commit their time and resources to it. And then also to change the way folks are thinking. And I think this is particularly true in fast-moving organizations, SOCOM being one, where they can move quickly, both to acquire, but also to implement. And yet it's still a human-built organization, maybe even relying on that more so when you look at the importance of identity and community in the different special operations elements. And so understanding the stories of each of those, small groups that form part of this larger whole, how do you show them that they have a place in the future that is, say what command wants them to understand? Because that's not something you should ever take for granted as a leader. You can't assume that people are going to understand your story for change. It's like kind of a change management question as much as a creative one.
Yeah, 100%. I could, and you can feel that as you're sort of you're charting, you're pathfinding out there, and you can feel the power or the importance of not only the storytelling sort of at the edge, but back in the Pentagon as well, and trying to win resource to scale and it's just a very powerful tool and often underestimated tool. And I just got to give you much respect for being one of the best
one of the things we hope is that it feels accessible to people,
Yeah.
That everybody's got stories in them. And when we're, running our workshops, we're often trying to, bring people to a point where they feel comfortable tapping into that to address something complex. It might be creating a narrative that supports, as we do for the Blue Horizons program at the Air Force, a project that one of their fellows is working on that could be literally, mission shaping or changing or life-saving for their service, and getting them to kind of come to that place where they can say, all right, I can actually use this as a tool to help convince a senior leader to give me permission to do something unorthodox, or it's for funding. I think too, also the overall mission concepts and kind of the operational environment is getting really complex. It's fast moving, autonomy and AI and robotics are all one piece of that, but so is the cognitive domain. There's a lot of other elements. And so being able to work, for example, with the Raiders, right, at MARSOC, we've done that through two different commanders, which is, I think, really great to see that we've had that ability to have continuity, because it's not just that it's someone's, personal interest that they think narrative is great or Ghost Fleet is cool, but rather that there's value, in the formations. And so with the Raiders, we've been working with them for a number of years and doing everything from, helping them kind of put their operating concepts into a vision so they can share it internally as much as with, say, broader SOCOM, but also even they've used some of the narratives to actually design training exercises before I send teams out that are based off that. So to me, that's a really good validation of, a somewhat unorthodox approach. But to me, if we're in this era of warfare where surprise is increasingly difficult because of ubiquitous sensing and modeling, how do you do something really creative and original? Like that's the human edge in this kind of AI moment.
Well, you're at the right place, because actually Skapa in Swedish, now I know you have Norwegian heritage,
right? Yeah.
Right? Is it the same word? Skapa in Swedish means to create.
I don't know what the word to create in Norwegian is.
Yeah.
I should know that, but I'm going to say it's probably pretty similar.
So, and we're focused here on creating the future of defense and security. So it's this creativity, this imagination is so important. Like I said, and not only imagining the future, but bringing it to life. You have to be able to show the art of the possible. Okay, so what are you working on right now? And before, what are you working on right now?
The bulk of what Peter and I are doing now is on useful fiction, which is, very much the outgrowth of the process from the two books. We're working on a variety of projects with.
What is useful fiction?
That's a good question. So useful fiction is basically a narrative futures, consultancy that Peter and I founded that, does three things. One is write narratives, mini Ghost Fleets, to put it simply. The other is train people on not just how to do that, but we also do some workshops on artificial intelligence, how to use, some different ways of envisioning the future, but to understand the present. And then similarly, AI and cyber. And we do some foresight training as well. Things that we have naturally come to do in the course of our work. And then we also do a lot of consulting and advising, in that same vein. And so the three things together have led us to a place where, we're often working for commanders. Sometimes, they have stars on their shoulders, and sometimes they're, lower down in a formation or a unit. And we're bringing, the visions that they often are trying to articulate into a totally different format that can be shared internally as much as, with like we're doing for the Raiders, the more kind of up and out. And it's really crucial too at this moment, I think, because when you look at all the different ways we're distracted, or our attention is being, called to things that are important. I mean, just we're all busy, first of all, before all that, being able to get a piece of content in front of someone that is going to help them learn a little bit through something hopefully engaging like a story. A story is something you often want to share. Hey, I just read this. And the other side of it is sometimes people share stuff they hate, but that's okay too. Like if someone hates something we write, that's fine because they're talking about it. I hated this short story because they didn't depict, robotics accurately, because we really would have to, we wouldn't have those kinds of problems with, say, battery life, but our research says that would be the case. That's a conversation they're going to have internally. And so for useful fiction, it is the vehicle through which to keep doing this and refining it importantly. Every year we're kind of thinking, how do we do this better?
How is AI changing your work?
Yeah, I mean, AI is empowering people to, throw a August and Peter story into an LLM, right? And try to get the same thing. But the reality is for what we do, I find, and we run useful fiction, AI to be helpful in the I would say like the tail, not the teeth.
Yeah.
I don't see it being useful in my writing in the ways that some days I wish, but we're just not there. And then more importantly, what is the value of something that's commoditized? And originality itself, I think, is sort of called into question, when an imitation engine basically reapplies a pattern, right, to create something that's a facsimile, but it's not the same thing. That said, I mean, in cybersecurity and watching what the Mythos, breakthrough revealed, we are in a very different era than we were, I would say, 30 days ago. And that has to be, I think, considered on the writing side. Visually, maybe because I'm not we work with, human illustrators, but, sometimes they use visual tools and stuff. I think you can't be too doctrinal about it. Otherwise, I think you're going to lose the potential at some point.
Yeah, I think I find myself and Mary, our our producer here, we were just talking about that not too long ago. I find myself going, back to first principles, back to the whiteboard, sort of the original thought and looking for space and time to think, on my own without the AI. And when you were talking about sort of your referencing and your footnotes, I mean, you still do that old school style. I mean, you're reading, you're citing, and
yeah. I mean, research is a way I've found. I've actually watched this from seeing one of my daughters use Notebook LM to help her. If there's like a gap in what she's learned in the classroom, the teacher hasn't taught it, she'll go find, a podcast or a YouTube video and have Notebook LM summarize it, give me some other alternative ways to approach this. The challenge, I think, is to really understand that we have a choice in this. And the sense of agency is another word that I would go back to describing with Burn-In. And that a lot of the conversations around AI talk as if like it's a tsunami, washing us all towards some unknown destination, or even a destination that's pretty dire, depending on your point of view. And that's not actually what it is. Like we have a choice. We all have agency. Every day we don't act on it, we lose a little bit. But I think especially for leaders, they have to decide, yes, you could automate potentially, probably not effectively, a 30-year company overnight, and you'll get a bump in your stock price and your board will pat you on the back. But like, are you actually going to create a better experience or product over the mid to longer term? I'm very doubtful about that. That said, we are in an era where productivity is being changed, but we need a little more fidelity from the tools that we're using. Again, can you trust that your Claude bot is going to respond to your email exactly as you would? Can you trust that the email you asked it to create for you or the narrative you asked it is truly original or not? We could spend the rest of our lives eating all of our meals cooked in a microwave. But like if you've had a steak on a skillet, with butter spooned on it or grilled outside, it is not the same thing as microwaving your steak. And I don't want to live in a microwave steak world. And so I think that's a little bit how we have to think about it, that we should, very carefully consider when we use these. And that's a personal as much as an organizational choice, and probably some policy wrapped up in that too.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was a captain of a PC, a patrol coastal, I used to say the three most important pieces of equipment on the ship were the guns, the engines, and the grill. And so you just sort of touched a very sweet memory for me, because that organic thing of cooking and serving others and just kind of going back to the community of and the time it takes to grill, and the conversations that you have around the grill. So
yeah, that's a good metaphor for, I think, some of those trade-offs.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear how you feel there's a consideration, or whether you think we're kind of charging too quickly into some of this stuff, and where the value is, because I think it's easy to be too resistant. You're seeing this generationally, where folks are like, I don't want to be automating myself out of a job, which is the burn-in thesis, nor do you want to be a Luddite.
Yeah, it's funny because here, this is my business, right? Skapa is to create the future of defense and security. We're doing cutting edge work in machine learning and AI, autonomy, just really frontier work. The other part of my job is as the chief strategy officer. And so I'm trying to imagine the future, chart the direction, make bets, where we invest and whatnot. So I lean in on one side and then I step back on the other. And it's a balance, I think.
I like to say I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss.
That's great.
Like, it's probably going to work out.
Yeah.
I like to believe in our better angels, to use the phrase, but also to have that kind of weather eye on things, and that many of these capabilities, for all their benefits, have, an inverse, right? There's an alpha and an omega.
Okay, so this is the Skapa Podcast, creating the future. This is the point in the podcast where we ask you to articulate what the future looks like, the future of warfare. Now you're, 6 years past burn-in. You're doing all the useful fiction. Tell us about the future of defense.
As questions go, it's about as big as it gets, but it's arguably one that, we have to be thinking about every day. It's not something that people can put off anymore. The way I'll frame my response is, like, what are the things I think we need to think more about? Because there's a lot of, heat and light, on autonomy and robotics, and we can see the relevance, whether, the department can acquire them at scale and implement them and make some of those core trade-offs. If you have 24 hours in a soldier's day, for example, do you spend that additional, trade space that you might take away from, casualty care or marksmanship to learn how to fly an FPV or to manage a flock of them? That kind of thing is important. But the two areas that I think are really critical, one is space. The ability now to really understand what's possible with a lot of the tools that are computational, like, the AI family, in terms of modeling, but also capabilities now in and on orbit. And then beyond that, just the new space economy that's coming. And there is, I think, an underappreciation. We pay a lot of attention to SpaceX. Thankfully, we had Artemis 2 with a successful mission. People are looking up again. But we really have to understand the strategic importance of these steps. The economics of space are going to be shifting, more and more to favor, I would say, a democratized launch capability, which is going to give, super empowered individuals, new says in what happens. At the same time, the weaponization of space is going to have, profound implications for what happens on the ground, delivering effects from space, not just the kind of Cold War rods from God stuff, but, cyber, EW, the things you can't see. Create a lot of really interesting operational, opportunities and challenges, for not just the space, force or the, the Air Force space components, but for, special operations, for, the Navy particularly. What's a transparent ocean look like, for example, in the operating environment like that? If we lose our submarine edge, that is, for example, something that is going to be a before and after moment, if there's, say, a quantum sensing breakthrough from space. So that's one area. The other is the cognitive domain. And, that's a really important one too, I think, in which we're trying to understand neurology and the human condition through technology, and sort of this odd, OODA loop almost, where the weaponization of attention, the thing I fear most is the kind of weaponization of, like, my kids, right? That their attention and focus gets, to become a tool in the ends of someone, who's on the adversary side of things, whether it's making them angry or distrustful or, willing to share, things that undercut, right? And that's not just on the social media side, because you're seeing more and more the ability to target individuals at scale. So much commercial data now, you can do it without even having any, kind of magic powers. But certainly, the amount of information that China's stolen over the last 15 years gives them an incredibly powerful targeting tool to, really begin to kind of shape individual perceptions in countries around the world, particularly ours. Russia has some of that same, I think, ambition. I mean, it's a difficult area because you're talking about something that, doesn't have a thing with wings, right? I can't point to a Lucas drone and say, there's the future, in cognitive warfare. And yet, I just, in my gut, in that kind of sense of when I know there's a story there, so to speak, I can see all around the world instances where we're really not equipped to understand the war that's being fought. And it's one of the reasons that I'm like, we are in World War III. It just doesn't look like anything from the 20th century. And there's going to be more episodic tidal ebbs and flows. But when we look back, I think, and say, at America at 300, we're going to see, that this was actually a period of quite intense conflict, but unlike anything we'd ever seen.
In that space, where is the domain? Is it only on social media? You referenced something else. What's the other domain?
I would say that, you have not only the ability to shape perception with social media, but, prediction markets are emerging as one other one, for example, financial markets, simply changing the political, pH balance in a society, that it's easy to kind of lock in on what goes viral or not. But the tools now to shape and influence, to make things, to make a person's experience, fundamentally different, so they respond in a way that they might not have before, that serves a national or a group's interest, is unfortunately here. And, it's a little bit like this moment when I go down this path and it's like the tinfoil hat goes on. And, but fundamentally, that's a revelation, I think, in terms of understanding warfare, to win without fighting, which is, of course, both Sun Tzu, but also if you look at the informatized warfare the PLA has been pushing for a while internally, it's an expression of that same thing. And I think attribution, the cyber concept being very difficult in this realm, makes it harder.
Yeah. What was you said there was a couple of things. You said space, cognition. Is there anything else that you think will?
The other is in the biological realm. And, I do not have a scientific bone in my body that makes me well equipped to really dig into the research and science. But, the more we understand about how little we know about the brain, that's important. But more importantly, synthetic biology, I think really being able to manipulate, gene level material, whether it's, biocompute, whether it is simply creating and fabbing physical structures or drug compounds, on demand. I mean, this is a massive transformational force in warfare for expeditionary operations, for one, but also just creating potentially more resilient forces in an era when weaponization and miniaturization are going to have a braiding together. If you can create, say, a drug, and this was true, 7 years ago, using one of the early, or 6 years ago, one of the early LLMs, you can create, basically nerve agents, using an AI model. There are researchers in Switzerland that pulled this off. We are now at the point where, you're looking at some of the gene folding technologies and things that are AI driven that are really exciting from a health perspective. It could be transformational in medicine for many different ways, but also, of course, is the optimist who stares in the abyss. I see what's the bad guy going to do. And so there's a lot of downstream, potential implications for,
like, superhumans,
I think that is part of it. But, if you pull back for a second, in Western societies, our armed forces come from, civilian societies. So, what is the level of, whether it's modification or amplification of different, traits, or even repairing, gene traits in some cases, that then produces people who are going to be serving in armed forces. So is the force of 2050 or 2060 not a force of super soldiers like the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie from, the heyday of the 80s action or 90s action movie.
You just age yourself.
We both graduated. I'm unabashed
in 97.
Yep. But rather a society that is producing people who are themselves already at a baseline that is above what we are. And if you look back to what I was saying about space, so we're talking about kind of the orbital, the value of space data on Earth is one thing, but as we move to the moon, as we move on to Mars, not just with people, but robotics, and begin to extract economic value, there will be more movement, if you will, out that direction. That's going to require some of those same things. And that may be on us faster than we think. And is there a first mover advantage in that, as there is with AI and robotics? I don't know. The old adage, like, we can't play by the rules if the adversary doesn't. I don't believe in that with, say, AI and robotics either, but it'll be a very profound question that has, this is the essence of what it is to be human, not just, hey, did I write that or a machine write that, but what does it mean to be human? And so, again, you asked kind of a large question, but I think that has profound defense implications that we as a society really hopefully can begin to kind of think about sooner than later.
And the immediate thing that when you were talking about that was, we're outside the TD Garden, right? And, how does that, you don't have to answer this, but in my mind, it's like, well, what happens with sports? And, are there super...
Well, look, I've been a pro cycling fan for a long time, and throughout the whole Lance Armstrong era.
Yeah.
So I know what is possible to for an individual and a team, both like biologically, but also, in a culture and kind of anthropological sense, how you can change. And the European teams that were doping at the time too were just less effective, if you will. And so I think actually pro cycling, and I haven't made this point in a talk in a while, but I should be thinking about it, again, is I think one of the vanguards for this kind of question in the future of warfare, of what it is possible to do with, whether it's today gene doping, but, in the 90s, it was EPO, kind of red blood cell augmentation, sera, and others, growth hormone, things that, a lot of influencers are peddling, I suppose, already, but we're now at a place, though, where, the systematic and data-driven approaches to that pro cyclists, I'm not saying that everyone's doping now, but their approaches to nutrition, performance modification, take superloading carbohydrates, right? If you can consume 150 grams of carbohydrates an hour in a bottle or even eating it, that changes your ability to, your body to do work. That's incredibly important if you are, say, in the special operations community too. If you need to move on foot from A to B in a certain time, are you now drinking, the same bottle that someone riding the 17th stage of the Tour de France, up like the Alpe d'Huez is? Maybe. Recovery, right? That's another thing too. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from sports. Whether that makes the Bruins, undefeated, I would just kind of cover my eyes, I think, if it did, but
is that the final thing you want to talk about?
I mean, I'd love to talk about robotics too.
Yeah,
because I think that's really relevant. It's very what I've talked about in those other three are they're almost more abstract, and I think, again, that's that instinctive, approach that I have, and I can kind of see the different, can see the stars in the constellation, but we're really trying to figure out, what it is and what to do about it. But, we're now here looking at the robotic capabilities that, you're developing, that others are in a flat out race to produce, things that are affordable, some that are attritable, some that are, going to be valuable, beyond kind of their initial or few use cases. And then also, what does that mean for the really fundamental, questions when you're building a force? It's like, show me your budget, right? And I'll tell you what your priorities are. And, we're now looking at a potential plus up that is almost unprecedented, 5% of GDP, potentially. A lot of people with, financial industry background, in the Pentagon, journalists, putting this in context today. For example, I think we're at a point where you may see a lot more unbridled, department spending on these capabilities to create that moment where there's going to be a lot of failure, but maybe a few breakthroughs. But, the ultimate crucible, though, is conflict itself. Is it useful? It doesn't matter if it's, valuable, back home, so to speak. It needs to prove itself in combat. And the situation in the Middle East with Epic Fury is one of those, but we're in constant contact in the Pacific, and again, different ways. And as Task Force 5/9 too, it's a similar thing. I mean, you were in an environment that was very contested. And so I think those are great, battle labs, if you will. And so I think we have to have that mindset. There's a corollary to that question too, which is, we have a defense industrial base. It has had an industrial in it, right? In that DIB, acronym, since World War II. And, are we now going to be getting closer to like a defense digital base? Is there something that is going to be an evolution in that model where, design and build need to be separated because of, simply the economics, don't work, or the parties won't, evolve in the legacy companies, or simply, the threat environment is going to be moving so fast that if you get too wed to one approach, and if a company gets too wed to one business model, you might not actually innovate to meet that evolution in, EW waveform that, obviates your sensor package. And that if things aren't, I don't know, maybe more modular, if they aren't able to be scaled differently, you're going to be in a place where it's of no value. And this is I think the paradox with scale. It's easy to say, let's build a lot of attritable systems. And I think in many people's minds, that's like the drone swarm shows with like 2,500 quadcopters. And I kind of envisioned something much more heterogeneous and ugly, something much more natural, looking at like a savanna, there's animals, they're all different kinds and they all do different things. I think that's a much more realistic portrayal of what an actual operational future looks like that's successful. If we get too wed to, I think, any one, paradigm, if you will, but that's hard when you're doing 5-year budget plans and you have to go to Congress every year. So there's some structural stuff there too, but I think those forces are quite powerful in play.
Okay, so now I want to go back to where we began. You were on Market Watch, correct? Or
CBS Market Watch is a financial news organization.
Okay. So what is the future of the defense tech market? I mean, there's a lot of new entrants. The zone is being flooded with venture.
Yeah.
The incumbents are being disrupted. What do you think is the future for this ecosystem and how does this play out?
One of the questions that really interests me is the cultural one. Many of the super primes resemble their customers, for good reason. There are risk-oriented organizations, right? How do you buy down as much risk as possible? There's a tension there. You have a lot of people who've served and then go work for them. Many of the Silicon Valley firms are operating in a totally different, part of the zoo and have different kinds of people there. Of course, there's a lot of, crossover too with people who've served, et cetera. But I think that's a really interesting paradigm when you don't have legacy companies and new ones coming in with new entrants, new ideas, blending, though, the operational experience as well. On the capital side, you can see the bump that, Allbirds just did this by declaring themselves an AI company. Really? They got a 580% bump in their.
Do you have Allbirds on?
No, these are a different one.
Okay,
but they'd be AI shoes, soon enough. They're selling off the shoe business, become an AI company, and the stock popped like almost 600%. So like the market values, sprinkling AI on things, and I'm not saying that's not a meaningful shift. Defense has some of that same fervor. And I've seen 2 different booms and busts, in my Market Watch era, the first and the second .com boom. So I'm very curious, like how patient capital will be, because at a certain point, the department has to buy. If it doesn't buy, the capital will go elsewhere. And that may be natural, that you'll have a few companies strong enough. One of the kind of like pullback concerns would be that are the companies that can endure and survive going to ultimately be innovative enough? Or do they, again, kind of follow in that same pattern of resembling the customer, becoming more risk averse, not in the ways that are helpful, maybe for the end user, but rather for their own, financial kind of, and that's a very realistic thing. You have fiduciary responsibility. Mm-hmm. Private companies versus public is another paradigm. So, we need a lot of wisdom on the parts of like boards, but also, patient capital. And, certainly some VCs are doing that. But I think that's a really, really important point that people kind of lose track of. Like not all money is the same, just like there's different flavors of money in the Pentagon.
It's interesting, as you were mentioning, I was sort of internalizing what you're talking about in our position here at Saab. We have very patient capital. We're a publicly traded company, but the capital is very patient. We feel very well positioned in this environment in a very humble way. Swedes, Nordics are very humble people. But it's just going to be super interesting to see how this all plays out.
I think the European defense scene is really interesting right now, because there's more of a national will to spend and also to, innovate and then actually implement, some of these capabilities. And we're in new territory. There's big meta conversations about NATO, obviously, that I'm acutely interested in. From a fictional perspective, one of my favorite short stories I wrote was back in 2017. It was for the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. They had a war game, and it was called Underbelly. But it was about like how would the U.S. fight and support NATO? It was actually in Ukraine if the traditional treaty structure was broken. Right, we weren't technically part of it. How would we do it? And so, what are the unorthodox and other ways? I think it's a really important thought experiment that anybody in the industry has to think about, because there's a lot of, very profound implications for our defense industrial base if we can't
What's the name of that? And is it
Underbelly.
on your website?
It's you can still find it on the Modern War Institute at West Point's website. And,
okay. Yeah, we'll have
if
to.
anybody
we'll
wants
have
a
to
copy,
read
they
it.
can email
We'll
me.
have to read that.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to share today before we wrap it up here?
I think the future of work in the defense space is really interesting, and the kind of talent management piece. And it goes again back to my kind of, I think, the idea that people want to be the heroes of their own story, especially the villains, right? But I'd love to kind of know how you're thinking about that, because you have now a need to understand technology, but also national missions and security in ways that's different, that on one level is really encouraging because you're going to get fresh ideas, fresh voices. On the other hand, those people have a lot of choices too. This
is central to sort of who I am and what I believe about building teams, right? And for me, it's you always start with the mission, right? And the values, and are those aligned? And then what I always try to do is get as many different perspectives focused on the operational problem we're trying to solve. And I've found, when you do that, you really get creative ideas about how to solve that problem, because you have a guy like me who's, been out at the edge, not really constrained. I was never institutionalized in the Navy, and that was good and that was bad. I was one of my mentors said, the Navy ducks pick ducks, and you're not a duck, Michael. So that paired with a Mary Mattingly, who's this brilliant chief of staff, who's brings good energy and has a very different perspective. Her sister's in the Navy, coupled with a PhD in machine learning and AI, and so that all those different perspectives on the same problem and going back to first principles, I think, is very, very important to ultimately imagining the future and how you want to create it. Now, it's easy to put it on a whiteboard. It's very hard to translate ideas into the physical world, and crossing that sort of cyber physical boundary is really hard to do. It's easy to say, it's easy to put on a PowerPoint, it's easy to brief, but it's very hard to do in the real world. And it takes resilience, and it takes persistence, and it takes finding a way to yes. Just relentlessly.
The Department of No adds people every day.
Yes, yeah.
That's also where narrative fits in, right?
Yeah.
Like, being able to bridge that vision with, as you said, the kind of IRL, right?
Yeah.
How do you actually make the thing?
Yeah. August, this has been absolutely a joy,
Likewise.
an honor. You're a brilliant storyteller. You're a brilliant mind. You've imagined the future. People are creating the future based on the stuff that you've written. It's just a real honor to have you on the Skapa Podcast.
It's great to have a chance to do this. And I've been a fan of your work for a long time. So we'll keep the conversation going.
Definitely. Thanks, August.
Thank you.
All right.